you all did such a good job of making that the story with the kinds of talking points that people can repeat anyone can repeat them
ad nauseum.
Ad nauseum and without thought. And I think folks who advocate for reproductive health rights and justice, we don't have that same power in the same way. It's so much more nuanced in the ways that we talk about it. So it was very, very powerful and able to rewrite the history, even though, the organization that I run, there were, white male clergy people all across the country getting people access to safe abortion care before Roe. Sure. And it's almost like that history has been erased. But moments like this and you being willing to talk about it, I hope that we are educating people on understanding that it was always a politically motivated issue.
Hi, my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is a podcast that I do called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today I am in conversation with Reverend Katey Zeh, and she is the Chief Executive Officer of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice and the author of this book right here, which we're going to be talking about, A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement. And I have read the book and have some marks in it to prove it. So, Katey, I actually prepared a little bit here. Let me, before we get into this book and talk about the contents of it, let me talk with you a little bit. I like to kind of unpack a little bit of who someone is on a personal level. I think is much more interesting than just diving into the content. If you asked me about myself and we had just met, rather than telling you that I'm a writer of yada, yada, yada books or doing this, that, and the other, I would tell you that for the last 14 years, I've been doing daily childcare for my 3 youngest of 5 grandchildren. I cooked them a really good pasta con parmigiana today for lunch because they're all away from school, ages 14 through 8. I have 2 older grandchildren who grew up in Europe and 3 grown children. I've been married to Jeannie for 53 years, got her pregnant when we were 17 and 18. I paint, I write, that's who I am. The least interesting part of my life is what I would call the sort of, oh, what do you do? Answer to the question, which is always about career and status and position, blah, 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 blah. And as I get older, I'm 70 years old now, that's what I'm least interested in talking to anybody about, because it doesn't interest me at all. So where I'd like to start with you is not the kind of copy you read on the back of a book, like this very interesting book that we're going to be talking about, but instead what you actually care about, which is not this book, because life's too big for that, which is not the fact that you're a reverend or whatever. There has to be things in your life where beauty touches you, where meaning touches you, where what you really would give your life for impacts you on a daily basis. And it's very rarely, in my experience, the bio stuff or the career stuff. It always has to do with where a person really lives, which for me would be, right now in order of preference, taking Nora to the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts, yesterday because she had a day off from school, learning about an artist that I knew nothing about, reliving the routine of wandering around the museum with her and rejoicing in the fact that my little 8-year-old granddaughter, the youngest in our family, is at home in the MFA. Can take off and say, I'll rejoin you in the atrium later, go look at what she wants to look at, take me around. And it's like, okay, I've won one battle here. I've got a little girl who loves this museum and it's part of her life and she will remember this. Okay, that's what I care about.
Okay.
I've gone on way too long. You can go as long as you want. Who are you?
Well, so what's interesting about this to me is that as a woman, I am always asked to define myself in who I am in relationship with. And so often the professional or the vocational is not at the forefront. So I'm actually having this weird response where I'm like, everybody always wants to know who I am to others versus who I am in myself. So maybe just saying that says a lot about who I am, that I define me. And that's taken me a long time, probably until the last few years. I'm almost 40, to say, actually, I am my own human being in my own right, not in relationship to those around me or who I care for. Those relationships are very important, but they are not, they do not define me. So I hope that you don't mind a little bit of resistance.
Not at all. Good answer. So go there.
So, what undergirds the book and my life's work up until this point is really a calling that I'm here to be a healer. And that has a spiritual healer in many ways, and it's taken lots of different forms. But what drew me to, caring for people going through reproductive crises or crises of any kind, it's just that's where I've landed, is really because that's what I feel like I'm here to do. I'm here to be a healer, and that happens in one-on-one relationship, the people I live with and am in community with, but also on a bigger scale. And so I think that that's absolutely what defines me. And a lot of that is about self-healing, doing my own work. I think you and I maybe share some background. I grew up in a very, very conservative white evangelical church community. So unlearning that and all of the scripts that I was taught about who I was supposed to be, and actually discovering who I actually am and who I am becoming. That self-discovery I'm very passionate about. And I find the more that I do that and talk about it, the more other people in my life do the same thing, because I think healing begets healing. Other things that I'm passionate about, I love helping people move their bodies. I'm a group fitness instructor.
Yes, I gathered that. Very interesting, by the way. We'll dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, I love, that's a space that's so complicated for so many people. I think our relationships to our bodies, for everybody, I think female-bodied people in particular, is a very complicated relationship. And so being able to be in that space, and even without saying the words, but just embodying kind of a joy of what our bodies can do. I love doing that with others and leading people through that. So that's a fun part of my life. I do have a partner, and we have a child, and they are my biggest cheerleaders and supporters. They ground me. Some days I think I would like to go live in a cave by myself. But they really are the ones who hold me in community. And I'm really, really grateful for the human beings I get to share my life with. I'm very spiritually curious. I'm kind of open to exploring almost anything. I started studying astrology. I love to read tarot cards. I found the divine in all the spaces I was told the divine does not live. In my spiritual exploration. And so I'm always like spiritually curious and wanting to have conversations or learn about things that, were kind of discouraged for so long, because I've actually found so much sacredness in those things. So
let's unpack some of that background a little bit. Let's dive back, because you were talking about having come from a kind of what you put forward as kind of a similar background to mine, maybe an evangelical background, fundamentalist, Bible believing, however you want to describe that. So just tell me a little bit of thumbnail of that story, not where you are today, but where you were then, and then maybe a little bit of the bridge to where you are now, that kind of progression.
Sure. I did not grow up in a religious household, but I grew up in Southeast Georgia in a small town where you can pick up the evangelical Christianity, even if you're not within the church itself. The first time I went to church was with my maternal grandmother when she was terminally ill. And to be honest, I really loved it because I had never been exposed to any of the stories really until then. And because it was more invitational where I could just listen, I was really curious about who this Jesus guy was. So I was probably very drawn to him as a healer, given what I've said. So I actually found it quite fascinating. And after she died, that was when I moved more into the evangelical culture. It was, the late 1990s, early 2000s, where purity culture was becoming a really big thing, and youth group and that sort of thing. And I think it started as connection to my grandmother because she wasn't around, but it quickly became a place of community and belonging for me. And so I just kind of went along with the rules. I'm very rule abiding. So having rules was really helpful for me.
Hmm.
And it gave me a sense of belonging and community for sure. And those things I still treasure and value. And when I got to college and I started to explore theologically what the historical church was like, especially the first 400 years, I thought all of this has been withheld from me. There's a whole rich story of how we got these doctrines, and there wasn't agreement, and there's a lot of interesting history here. So I started to explore that academically, which made the faith community very small and uncomfortable for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that really was the starting point for me, was when I was exposed to the actual history of how Christianity came about, and got to critique it and learn that there were lots of different ways to be a person of faith, to be a Christ follower that didn't look like the very restrictive rules that I had heard that honestly never really jived with me. If I'm perfectly honest, I went along with them because there wasn't an option not to, but I think I always felt there was always an inner tension for me, especially around the social teachings, around queer people and women. It never sat right with me. It never felt right. So I think once I've found a way out, I could start to make sense of that inner tension that I had always felt, which honestly, I think was the divine kind of nudging me from within early on.
You know, a little while ago, I'm just reaching over here to my unofficial stack of books. I interviewed someone who wrote a book, Beth Allison Barr, The Making of Biblical Womanhood.
Oh,
Yeah, and I had I enjoyed the interview a lot, and I'd read the book thoroughly and dog-eared all of it, and talked to Beth. But of course, you know, my basic quibble with her book, and this is related to what you're talking about in terms of your journey, is she is an academic who comes, I guess, still from an evangelical position, and is trying to make the case for the making of biblical womanhood based on the fact that, from her point of view, the scriptures, as she would understand them, are valid and have been misinterpreted to somehow come up with a misogynistic message. And of course, I have a very different view these days from the one I grew up on, and that is that the biblical narrative is not misinterpreted. It was wrong. And I don't see it her way. I don't find myself trying to build bridges and say, well, you know, it's valid. If you really understood what Paul was saying, you balanced by whatever, or the way it was understood in some branch of the church in this or that century, we can see there's another way to read this. I think there's a lot, to me, and this is not a loaded question. I'm literally just asking you something. Do you look, as an ordained person, at the scriptures as a source that can be interpreted in some way that is helpful to people, or do you look at this original source as just flat out wrong in many places in which it speaks, not misinterpreted, but actually mistaken? Whether that's on the basis of science or history or morality, whatever. And that is not a loaded question. It's one I asked her, and we got into an interesting discussion after that. I differed with her view, and I don't know what your view is. I literally don't. That's not what your book is about that I've just read, but I think it's a pertinent question.
Absolutely. And I wrote a book prior to that called Women Rise Up, looking at some of the sacred stories through the lens of gender oppression that very much mirrors what we are dealing with today. They're the same exact issues of gender oppression. You know, in the ancient texts, we call them different things now, but they're the same. And so in that way, I think that they are wrong, and they can be instructive also. I mean, the fact that they're wrong, what was going on was oppressive and misogynistic, doesn't mean that we can't learn from them. And I think being really honest about, you know, what was going on at the time, but also that these are oppressive systems that are going on, and they still exist now in the same way, can be very, very helpful for people. And I'm not so far that way that I'm willing to kind of let go of the text altogether, because especially in the work that I do, I feel like that's almost just allowing the opposition to, you know, use these, what I think some are very beautiful sacred texts. And I do believe in the doctrine of revelation, in the sense that new things can be revealed to us from ancient sources. I think that there is there are many stories where I see, wow, people were resisting oppressive structures in these very creative ways. And I think that we can learn from that and ask, in these times, what does it look like for us to resist systems of oppression? And can we find inspiration and models from that? So I'm not willing to let it go altogether, but I definitely bring a critical eye to it. So it's trying to do both of those things. And I think liberation theologians do that. I think feminist theologians do that. Black liberation theologians do that. They're not willing to throw away the text. They claim the problems that are there and also say, and it's not only that, it's also this.
But
so that's where I land.
Yeah. I always wonder if the unwillingness to throw away the text is because the text is where the money is, in the sense that, when I walked away from the evangelical world, there was more money on our book tables on any given night than I earn in a year.
Yes. Oh, I understand that.
I have evangelical friends who are on the progressive side of evangelicalism. And one thing that I always find disturbing is to have people you're close to and have known for maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years, as I have, with names you would know instantly if I mentioned them, who are the leading progressive evangelical / Christians in the country today. And basically, but they still have book deals with people. They still get invited to Wheaton College and these other places.
Correct.
I don't, because I have literally burned the bridges. I am not jealous of them, because I will take the reviews my book get in the quote secular press any day over pandering to that audience. But I totally understand it, because there's been times in my life when I have gone flat ass broke because I have really burned the bridges. So I understand where they're coming from, but I also think that when they make the argument based on, well, we don't want to let go of the text because of the value of however it is, rather than coming clearly out and denouncing things, I have a real problem with that. And let me, before I ask you to answer that and to comment on it, again, I'm not fishing for a debate here, but that's just my point of view. The other thing I have a problem with is in the progressive Christian movement, what I'll call the pandering to global fundamentalism. We will talk about evangelicalism, we will talk about the anti-abortion movement, all very well and good, but I don't hear people talking about Modi of India and Hindu nationalism, where Muslims are being massacred with the approval of the state. I don't hear enough about what's going on in Tehran right now with women rising up.
Right.
I hear a lot more about a Muslim student in a small liberal arts college who was offended because some teacher showed a picture of the prophet. Personally, I don't give a shit, because right now, what I care about is tens of thousands of young women being beaten in the streets of Tehran.
Right.
What I care about is the fact that evangelical religion's problem is not evangelical religion's problems. It is fundamentalists' problem, whether it's stealing land from the Palestinians, whether it is in Tehran right now, beating young women and raping them in police stations, Saudi Arabia, 80 executions in one morning of people deemed terrorists who did nothing more than protest the state. I think we've got a global phenomenon going on of a turn to the radical fundamentalist right. Vladimir Putin's doing it right now, arguing against gay and trans people and saying that's why he's fighting in Ukraine.
Exactly.
That's two big things, and I know they're loaded. Take it away.
No, I completely agree with you. It's the weaponization of an ideology for oppression that I hear you talking about. And, specifically within the US context, because that's where I primarily work, we talk about it as white Christian nationalism. We're not talking about a religion. We are talking about a co-optation and weaponizing a text, a religion, a practice for political gain, for power over others.
Right.
And that, to me, that is what makes me so angry as someone who still does find value in the Christian tradition broadly, not without its problems, but it is the fact that it is being used by the state as a weapon against people who are already marginalized and oppressed, for power over, to control where people move around the planet, what healthcare they can access, what history they can learn. That is, for me, the antithesis of what any spirituality ought to be about, which is about honoring the fact that we are all divine beings that have autonomy and worth and ought to be able to flourish in our lives. Anything that's antithetical to that, to me, is a weaponization and a bastardization of what spirituality ought to be. And I think so often from the time of Constantine, that has been true with Christianity. And that's what I mean about learning about the history. Most people don't learn about how Christianity became the official state of the Roman Empire and how that changed the whole thing once it became a weapon of the state. Well, so I agree with you.
Yeah, Mary Beard makes that point in all her Roman history studies, that essentially the Roman Empire never went away. It simply became Christianized, but that it is still it is still the West today. I've interviewed other people recently who have been writing on this subject. But okay, we're kind of coming up to the halfway mark, and we haven't talked about
the book.
I'm going to reintroduce you here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. You are watching it live on Facebook, or you are listening to it as a podcast. If you like this conversation and many others that we have had, please like it in the online interweb sense, and subscribe and do all those good things. And today I'm talking with the author of A Complicated Choice, Katey Zeh, and here it is. This is the book. You've got it behind you, but I'm showing it even better than you.
You do. You have a great angle with it right there.
There you are. And I want, when I read a book, sometimes I pick a little passage out that I think actually kind of should have been on the cover.
Okay.
If the publisher, was on the ball, this is what they would have put on the cover, because it sort of says the book. I'm going to read this quote. This is pretty early in the book, and I have things later that I want to get to. But when we keep quiet about abortion and when our support is lukewarm and detached, we signal to people that we would rather not hear about their experiences. There is a culture of silence around abortion, and that silence is shaming and isolating on both a personal and collective level. We have to face our internalized abortion stigma. Otherwise, we keep ourselves at arm's length from the lived reality of abortion and from the people who need our support and compassion the most. That's what should have been on the cover, because that sums your book up. That's why you wrote the book. And if you want to jump back further here in the back part of the book, when you have these subsections on response, you say, learn to respond with compassion to situations that bump up against your experience, beliefs, and values. And to me, that was the most enlightening is the wrong word, but the one that really kind of nailed it in bringing me, the reader, to bump up against things that aren't my experience, but to take the other person's experience seriously and listen to it and hear it. Have I missed the point, or is that what your book's about?
No, I think you've summarized it beautifully. It is about challenging abortion stigma. And how do we do that? It's by creating space for different stories. And those stories, by the way, for readers who haven't gotten here yet, and I hope they do read your book, are in the book, which is a mixture of those sorts of declarative statements and summary and a little bit of history, but also goes into, I didn't count them all, but what are there? Maybe 14? I think it's 17.
17 stories. Math has never been my strong suit. There are
it's 7
individual stories.
I should know. I don't remember.
Including someone you added late in the process who I actually happen to know who that was. So let's get into the book. But before we do, I'm going to look at a passage here that was from something that I think is very relevant to your book, another book on the issue. This is from Elise Hogue, who wrote this book called The Lie That Binds, and Elise ran NARAL for many years, the National Abortion Rights League, and is a friend of mine. And this is a book she wrote. And I'm going to read you a quote because it sort of ties you to me through this subject, in the sense that I was part of the early stages of the evangelical pro-life movement with my father, Francis Schaeffer, and Dr. Sierra Coop. And of course, what's odd is she was, of course, knew all about that, and then we've subsequently become friends. But she writes, the issue of reproductive freedom may be best understood as a canary in a coal mine, though not the only one. Systematic attacks on reproductive freedom are one of the classic hallmarks of democratic backsliding. Advocates for reproductive freedom, health, rights, and justice have spent the last several decades combating the elements of creeping authoritarianism. from disinformation and propaganda to the ongoing efforts to undermine trust in science and medicine, to a relentless barrage of attacks on institutions designed to protect individual liberty and free or fair elections. So Elise writes that in this book. And as someone who, mea culpa, was very much part in the 70s and 80s, when I was a very young man, of a kind of a family enterprise of right-wing activism in this country through the films Whatever Happened to the Human Race with Dr. Koop, really somewhat responsible as the producer-director of those films for making what she warns about become a thing. And I just want to interject one thing that I'm sure you know, but for people listening to this or watching it, can't be said enough because it's a hidden fact. It's almost kept a secret in evangelical circles. When we first came out with Whatever Happened to the Human Race, our fight was not with feminists who were pro-choice. Our battle was with the evangelical majority who were also pro-choice at that time, including the Reverend Billy Graham, who I met with 3 times with my father in person and begged to join our cause, who point blank refused because he was pro-choice. So was Dr. Criswell, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention.
That one I knew.
Who I met with. And we also met with and browbeat the editorial board of Christianity Today magazine into eventually taking our position, who at first would not, because this was regarded as a Catholic issue like contraceptives were at that time, and nothing that was on their radar screen. And the reason I mention this is because Elise talks about the lie that binds. Part of that lie was assuming that somehow evangelical Christians and or Christians in general had always been against abortion.
Right.
They had not.
Right.
And
right.
part of and what we had to do is talk them into even thinking that this was their issue, let alone a litmus test based on which you're going to vote for Donald Trump 40 years later because he's made a deal with Franklin Graham and other right-wing activists to put our kind of judges in positions of leadership. So that's a long preamble to your book, and I want to really get into the book, but the first thing I want you to do is talk a little bit about that historical context and the kind of fight within Christendom, aside from the big battle on the culture war, left-right kind of divide. How do you see all that today?
Well, I mean, it's hard to follow you giving an inside scoop on kind of the genesis of how that came to be, because these are things that I've only heard from other historians. But, just to reiterate what you said, there's never been, one viewpoint really on anything within Christianity, but especially about abortion. It's not ever something mentioned in the sacred texts. Catholics themselves argued about it. Abortion was legal in the United States with lots of support, before it became illegal, and then legal, and now, practically illegal in most places. So I think that, you all did an amazing job of rewriting the story so that people today, and I hope that this is changing, have this narrative that to be a person of faith, and they mean Christian, but they say faith, means that you're anti-abortion. I mean, you all did such a good job of making that the story with the kinds of talking points that people can repeat anyone can repeat them
ad nauseum
and without thought. And I think folks who advocate for reproductive health rights and justice, we don't have that same power in the same way. It's so much more nuanced in the ways that we talk about it. So it was very, very powerful and able to rewrite the history, even though, the organization that I run, there were, white male clergy people all across the country getting people access to safe abortion care before Roe. Sure. And it's almost like that history has been erased. But moments like this and you being willing to talk about it, I hope that we are educating people on understanding that it was always a politically motivated issue. This was never
about in on that, because I want your and again, this is not a loaded question. This is a real question. Something that has disturbed me in terms of the left and the pro-choice movement is that they actually find the same narrative that paints all Christians as having always been the enemy on this. And when I say Christians, I mean the evangelical. I'm using it in the term the way I was raised on it. We were Christians. Catholics weren't, we were the real deal.
Right.
Being a little facetious, but what I'm trying to say is this kind of black and white division actually suits both sides in our culture wars. These are the bad guys, we're the good guys, or flip
That's
it.
right.
What neither
That's right.
wants to know, and this is why I love the title of your book, A Complicated Choice. This is where people don't want to go, because no one wants this complicated. Everybody wants to be 100% unambivalent and correct across the board.
Right.
And I'm not talking about whether you have to re-legislate and re-argue this. I'm talking about just in the dishonesty that both the left and the right have brought to the debate in not understanding that this litmus test fails on every level, because there are all kinds of women who are conservative in many, many ways who were pro-choice. There are all kinds of people who were evangelicals who were pro-choice. Hello, Dr. Billy Graham in the 1950s and 60s is pro-choice. I mean, go figure. This doesn't fit the narrative of the New York Times either.
That's correct.
So talk a little bit about that. I mean, you're out there on the hustings with this message, ministering to people. What are you finding out there in terms of the ambivalence of the complicated choice part of the complication, just in that political sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people are longing for, especially now, a nuanced conversation where they get to talk about their own experience or their own family's history or the things that they were taught to believe about abortion that still have shaped them. And that's why I talk about abortion stigma, because I think it's impossible to be in this culture and not hear the anti-abortion message all the time. We internalize it just like racism, sexism, heterosexism, all of those things. It's just part of living in the culture that we do. And so giving people an opportunity to really sit with that. How does it make them feel? Where did it come from? Maybe they don't actually believe it, but they're not sure what to replace it with. People haven't had that space because they have felt like they have to choose, one or two sides. And I think on most issues that are human issues that are complicated, people have nuanced feelings about them. And I think that we have to create more space for the reality of people's lives. And my point is that, the stories that I tell are not only about the individual people, they are about pointing to the systems that put people in situations where they cannot flourish, period. No matter what decision they make about a pregnancy, they're not going to flourish because there are not the systems in place for them to do so. And that's what I hope to point to also. It's internal introspection for sure, but also not only for that, how do we then respond and listen to the people who've been doing this work for a long time saying, hey, if we actually want human flourishing, this is what it's going to take collectively for us to do that. And so I hope that the reader does the internal work first, but then says, and so now what? What do we do about this? How do we change the system? How do we identify white Christian nationalism in the way that it functions here and replace it or challenge it with something else? And it's a broader movement than just reproductive health rights and justice. I mean, these are things that impact white Christian nationalism, impacts all of us in lots of different ways. And I think we've done a disservice, especially, white women in leadership, especially around the decision in the 80s, like really making this a white woman's issue. In a lot of ways they talked about it rather than seeing it as this is about a much broader agenda that we need to be pushing for everybody, especially people who are most marginalized, Black women and others, so they can flourish fully, not just about access to abortion, but about, really being able to take care of your body and flourish with your family, so that's what I hope people get when they read the book.
Yeah, and I think they will. Again, this is Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a podcast, and so forth and so on. We're talking about A Complicated Choice by Katey Zeh. And one thing I wanted to do is just go into something in the book here a little bit. Maybe get my little markers here. Just to cut to not a hard part of the book, but one that will wake a few people up when they hear me read this, and then just let you talk about it a little bit, because I liked your honesty here, page 105. Abortion is a blessing, and you have that as a standalone. Where is it? Right there. Not the way usually, your editor will say, "Hey, you can't have single sentence paragraphs," but you did it. in that sentence, if that sentence made you uncomfortable, I understand. Abortion stigma impacts all of us, myself included. Let me explain what I mean when I say that abortion is a blessing. I'm not claiming that abortion is easy or without loss, grief, or other complicated emotions. To the contrary, I am affirming that the very process of identifying and coming to terms with one's full experience of abortion can lead to tremendous growth and positive change in a person's life. Abortion has the power not only to save lives, but to bless them too. So that's basically, as far down that path as anyone could put in print. And I want you to take off and give you the opportunity to talk about that part of the book a little bit. People will find it when they read it, but it's a good paragraph. It's a good sentence. And I'd like you to unfold it. I'd like to hear you unfold it a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I would have claimed that as strongly as I did in the book had it not been for writing the book and talking to all the people for the book, because that came from the conversations that I had with people who had experienced abortions in their own life.
Sure.
And they would say abortion was a blessing because abortion freed me from a toxic relationship. Abortion saved my life, my physical life.
Sure.
Abortion allowed for me to, change my career and do the thing that I always wanted to do. It was like this catalyzing moment for people. And that's what I mean about it being a blessing. I think in the same way that breakups can be a blessing or divorce can be a blessing. It's not without pain. And they can sometimes be that moment of really shifting things. And I think that that's true of any major life decision where you have the freedom to say, I'm going to do the thing that feels right for me, even though maybe it's scary or hard, and I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. And then it becomes the thing in retrospect that made everything else possible. And that is absolutely true of abortion. I wouldn't say it's true for every single person. People have to claim their own experiences. But it was so evident from talking to people that that was such a critical moment in their lives that I have to claim it as such.
Yeah.
And access to abortion is a blessing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I pulled that out to talk about because I would imagine that as you were going through this and in a later draft, you had to give some thought to that in terms of how could that be misquoted or misrepresented. But your book does back that up because that's what the stories do. So I knew, I kind of knew where that had come from, but I thought that you would want to go there because why not dive into the toughest saying, as it were, and say, okay, unfold that a little bit. Let me talk a little about my own journey on this issue, not because what I think about it matters, but I think that part of the lies that we're talking about, where it's convenient to the left and right as part of a paying job culture war shtick, is again this idea that no one can change their mind. And I did. Not only did I change my mind, I had been considerably involved with and part of, even though I was a young man, and you can argue, okay, didn't know any better, raised in that and so forth and so on. But the misogyny that I participated in was a shameful thing. And I've spent a lot of time writing about that and apologizing for it. But at the same time, having come from that background, it was a long process for me to, I put it this way, I moved away from my evangelical Christianity much faster than I was able to move away from the heated political involvement I'd had in the pro-life movement. In other words, for me, it flipped because I was so into that. So I think in my head, I was writing my novel Portofino, which was kind of my goodbye letter to the evangelical world I was raised in, a kind of a first step in that direction, several years before I did my last fundraising event for a crisis pregnancy center. I was out of the evangelical thing, but the politics, the hard right driving, we're right about that issue had so gotten into what I was doing that it took me a long time to unfold that. Well, 35 years, 40 years later, which we are today, sitting here, having told you about my grandchildren, et cetera, from my perspective today, I have a very different position on these issues than I had not only then, obviously, but even in the intermediate years where I was saying, well, it's a very tough thing and I'm ambivalent about it, but I think women ought to have choice. I'm kind of against abortion personally, but I think it ought to be legal, that kind of halfway mark. Today I have a very definite sense of clarity on this, and I would put it differently than this, and I want your reaction to that, and not to me, but just to this position. And a woman who teaches it in a university who's written on this issue was very helpful to me, Dr. Myrna Perez, and she was down at Harvard doing all sorts of interesting things and helped me a lot in her writing. But the way I see it today is very differently. It is not that every abortion is a blessing. For all I know, some of them are horrendous and destroy a woman's life, just like every other decision is not all a blessing.
Right.
I don't think you were saying every abortion is a blessing.
Mm-mm.
But I have a very different view of the legality and the legislation on abortion, and even on the moral question, if you want to go to the heart of it, the right or wrongness of it. And that is that by its very nature, every abortion involves a decision. And to me, there's only one question: who should make the decision? Mm-hmm. Is it a judge? Is it a legislator? Is it a family member? Or is it the woman who is pregnant? I don't know whether her decision's right or wrong for her. It's not for me to say. Mm-hmm. But I know one thing for sure. She's the only person in the room qualified to talk about this. So Frank Schaeffer and everybody else, shut the fuck up, back off, and allow her to make her decision, period. Mm-hmm. And I used to have all sorts of other packaging that went with that. Mm-hmm. Complexity, ambivalence.
Yeah.
No. I'm done with that. There is only one position on abortion that makes sense to me, and it's this: someone has to make the decision. Who's it going to be? Mm-hmm. It's not the decision won't be made. There are always going to be abortions. It's not that every decision is wonderful or terrible. It's not unpack the morality of abortion as if this sort of abstract question has to apply to this individual stuck in a situation. It's not even to say, because it's a woman and I'm pro-choice, which I am, I'm going to try to make her decision agreeable to everybody. Maybe she's wrong sometimes, but to me, it really boils down to just two things. One, someone has to make the decision. A, that's a fact. B, who is it? Mm-hmm. And I've never heard yet any argument that makes me think it ought to be someone other than the pregnant woman, period. Yeah. End of story. That's it. I'm not going to write a book on it because it would be 2 sentences long. Who's going to make the decision? It should be a woman. It's nothing to do with me. Shut the fuck up. That's right. My position.
Yeah. Well, and it points to, what undergirds so much of it is that pregnant people are not regarded as moral decision makers or as decision makers, period. And I think that even within the law itself, there's a lot of questioning of the moral decision making or just decision making of the pregnant person. Yeah. And that's broader than abortion. That's about people who can reproduce, period, because you'll hear stories of folks, while they're giving birth, the hospital will intervene and do things without the consent of the person giving birth. Sure. I mean, this is a much broader issue. Yeah. So for me, I'm comfortable with that frame. And then but then the question is, and can we make sure that everybody makes decisions within a context where they actually have everything that they need in terms of support to do that?
Sure.
And every pregnancy ought to be something that people consent to continue. Yeah. And that people ought to actually have choice. And I think the frame of pro-choice has been critiqued very rightly, that look at what's happening right now. Do people actually have choices that they can make, that they feel, choices, period, and choices that they feel good about? Yeah. That's the reality, is that for many people, those choices have never existed, and they certainly have been impeded upon because of the overturn of Roe. So there are people who have compulsory pregnancies now where they're forced to continue them without access to whatever they would need to then, continue that pregnancy well. Mm-hmm. So I'm comfortable with where you stand, and that the question goes, and so what do we do about that? So that people are not alone, right? People ought to be able to consult whoever they so choose to make a decision. Sure. And some of the things that come up in the book so much is that people felt so isolated. They felt like they could not
Yes.
could not engage the people who should support them in this one area. This is a secret for some of them. And that creates its own suffering. It really, really does.
Yeah. And it seems to me, you just touched on this point, and just to go into it a little further, that the problem we have in today's culture, that it relates to the abortion decision of the individual woman, is that the culture itself, and I have to finish this sentence before it's misinterpreted, not by you, but by people who are listening, is anti-life. Where's the paid parental leave?
Right.
Why don't we have that? Not just 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but a year and a half, 2 years for any parent of any gender. Where is the paid parental leave? Where is the backup for young children in terms of free medical care? Where have we got a system in place that gives people a priority when it comes to those who do choose to nurture life? And the sort of not even compassion, but basic common decency that says, I'm in your corner. The decency that individuals outside of a political context, even sometimes ones who voted for Trump, have, if they see, a young parent of whatever gender trying to carry 3 bags of groceries and push a stroller across the street, and they step up and help, because we are biological animals, which is, by the way, one reason we get on with our dogs so well, because we co-evolve. Love is a thing. And none of us would be here without community and support. The United States of America has designed a culture, and you can give it names, capitalism, whatever, but that's not my point here, which essentially, if you were trying to write a fictional story about a country that was anti-life, that says we don't want anybody to have a happy family or babies or reproduce or even have a relationship or start one. We're going to put career ahead of all else. We're going to put position and prestige ahead of all else. If you happen to fall pregnant, you are alone. And if you're a parent and are trying to even have a relationship today, we're going to give you a choice: online dating or loneliness. We're going to have a mental health crisis sweeping through our young people because we have completely screwed them over with tech and with no kind of in-between stage where we did a few experiments to see if this was good for anybody. When you look at the total picture of people unable to connect, dating falling to pieces in so many ways, relationships on the rocks, and I'm not talking about divorce statistics per se and so forth, no parental leave, no basic support for young families. Then on top of that, we're going to take Roe away. So we're going to make you have a baby if you fall pregnant. I can't think of a bleaker picture. And I know that I've gone a little bit to the edge on this, but I really feel that way. And I feel tremendously sad for younger people. I've been so fortunate in that Jeannie and I have had a real relationship, many ups and downs, horrible times, but we're very close together. We're not alone. And I have these grandchildren running around. I don't want that for everybody. That's not the right choice for everybody. But I want everybody to have a bite at that apple if they so choose. And I can't even figure out how they could buy a house now, how they could even find a place to live. So it's a little bit of a rant on my part. But I got to tell you, that burns very bright for me. And I just think the hypocrisy is so massive with people who say they're against abortion and then won't lift a finger to help that parent across the street carrying 3 bags of groceries and pushing a stroller. Where the hell have you been?
It's the lack of compassion.
I hate it.
And it makes me think about this illusion that we are separate from each other is so central to that. Because if you, just as a community, we learned, I think, during the pandemic that we are all connected. We cannot disconnect. And if you are a spiritual person at all, that's probably part of your spiritual beliefs, that we are connected to each other. We are all divine. So when I refuse to help someone I see in need, I'm actually not helping myself. I am actually not loving myself. And I think a lot of it has to do with self-hatred. A lot of this that I see has to do with just not loving and giving ourselves compassion. And then we don't show it to others. And I think back to what I said at the very beginning, when I was thinking about the messages that I got in an evangelical church, there was no emphasis on the love your neighbor as yourself, meaning
Right.
love self and neighbor. The way I love myself impacts the way I love neighbor. There was no emphasis on that part. It's very clear that the two are intertwined.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to love ourselves and one another? Because we are connected. And I don't think that we talk enough about that either. So a bit of a rant for me too. So we're on the same page. But the lack of compassion, that is the pandemic. Lack of compassion. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I must say, left, right, in between, and center, the one thing I really feel that joins all Americans together in a sort of a hell is placing, getting ahead, quote unquote, and material conquest. People say they don't, but we do. And I just think it's a killer, because to me, the environment in which anybody would want to have a family anyway would be one in which beauty, art, music, truth, love, compassion, sharing has nothing to do with gender, non-binary, straight, trans. It has to do with only one thing as far as I'm concerned, and that is, how do you define the word success? And if success defined in the American context is all about position and prestige, career and money, the values that actually make people happy, according to every single study that's going on, which is relationships, connection, friendships, the closeness to other people, empathy, compassion, we all pay lip service to that stuff. It's not mirrored in the legislation.
No.
It's not mirrored in the values. It's not mirrored in corporate America. And it's in that hammer and anvil beating people's brains out. It's in that context that I find your book so valuable, because we're saying, look, in the individual instance of a woman having an abortion, hold everything a minute. We've designed a whole culture that basically says that a woman that goes ahead and has a child in this culture has made an incredibly brave choice. And we're criticizing the woman who has the abortion when we've designed a culture that basically tells every woman, you're insane if you ever bear a child, because look at what we've created for you to bear this child into. We're not community oriented. We're not going to help you. We won't lift a finger for you. Good luck storming the castle. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, I can't refute that, even as someone who, myself has been pregnant and is a parent who, probably has had the best in terms of access to healthcare. I did not have any paid leave after my daughter was born. It's one of my biggest regrets. Never had that time to recover, and then, struggled to afford childcare. And then during the pandemic, I think all of that, even those of us who were managed to hold it together, just barely, all of that came crashing down. And these are things that people who are in poverty, who are Black or Indigenous or, immigrants have been dealing with,
Sure.
far longer. But I think as someone who, it then became my experience, right? Like I saw just how fragile it had been, even for someone like me who had support, who had access, who had the right skin color, who had the right education, the right job. It still wasn't enough even for me. So what are we saying for people who don't have access to all of that? How is that valuing life? It absolutely is not, to your point earlier.
Well, guess what? We're at that place now where I'm opening the book up one more time and saying A Complicated Choice, Katey Zeh, and in bookstores everywhere. Is that accurate? Out there?
You should be able to get it. You should be able to get it anywhere books are sold. It's available.
Where books are sold.
Places.
I'm always leery about saying that because I get enough advance copies. It's like, no, it's not coming out until March. But yeah,
it came out in February of last year. So
there you are. So it's out.
That's right.
And I hope you read it. But Katey, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Frank.
Good luck with the book, and stay in touch with me and stay in touch with us. And if this conversation has been helpful, please let people know about it once our good producer Ernie posts it, because I would imagine anybody following you will be interested in hearing you talk in this context. I think we've had a good conversation.
Yes, I've really enjoyed it. So lovely talking to you. And thank you for being so candid about your own background. I really appreciate that, that you're willing to talk about it in the way that you did. I definitely learned some things today. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you today.
Good, Katey, and all the best. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.